This is video number 18, and it's about content analysis, thematic analysis, and case studies. Content analysis first. A content analysis is a type of observational study in which we analyse behaviour by observing the content that people have created rather than observing the people themselves. The content could be visual or verbal or written material or some other form of media. And very often the object of a content analysis will be things in newspapers, magazines, television, radio, etc. So for example, let's consider a content analysis of a series of adverts on the TV. The first thing that we would have to do is decide on sampling. How are we going to sample this content? Do we sample the adverts every 10 seconds, every 30 seconds? That would be a time sample. Or do we do event sampling? For example, do you examine the advert every time a new character is introduced? Or do you examine them on an advert by advert basis? Event sampling. We then have to decide on coding, and this is a lot like defining the operationalised behavioural categories that you'd use in any normal psychological observation. So, for example, we have to decide how we are going to put the content into categories. In our advert content analysis, for example, we might look at the statements that people make in an advert. Are they making factual statements, or are they making statements of opinion? And we would have to decide how we're going to code those observations. And finally, we have to work out how we're going to represent the data. Do we want to do it quantitatively, in which case it might just be a tally chart, or do we want to do a qualitative description of the content that we are observing, in which case we'd have to write a descriptive sentence for each observation. Content analyses have strengths and weaknesses. On the strength side, they have very, very high ecological validity, and that's because the content that we are observing is a part of the real and true and actual everyday world. It's not artificial in any way at all. It has high ecological validity. Content analyses also tend to be very replicable, and that's because anyone can access the same media, anyone can apply the same behavioural categories, and content analyses tend to generate very replicable outcomes in that way. Content analyses also have very few ethical issues because there aren't any people in them. We don't have to worry about right to withdraw or protection from harm because there aren't actually any people in the content analysis, it's just observing media. On the negative side, content analysis can suffer from observer bias, and that's because when we're doing a content analysis, and especially when we're defining the operationalised codes that we're going to apply to it, we can bring our own prejudices and preconceptions to that analysis very easily if we're not careful. Have to be very careful about observer bias, and also culture bias is a problem, can be a problem in content analyses because the content tends to come from one culture, which is not representative of humanity at large. A thematic analysis is like a content analysis in as much that it's indirect. We're not observing behaviour, we're an observation of content. But unlike the content analysis, in a thematic analysis, themes only emerge during the analysis and after the analysis has finished. A theme is a recurrent idea, explicit or implicit, which emerges during the analysis. In other words, as we're going through the content, we might start noticing things that we hadn't thought of. So, for example, in our content analysis of TV commercials, we can start by coding the data. Is the character male or female? Are they making a factual statement or a statement of opinion? But as we're going through this analysis, we might start noticing something that we hadn't thought of. For example, maybe all of the characters, male or female, are really attractive or beautiful. Or maybe we notice that the weather always seems to be perfect in a TV commercial. Now, we wouldn't have noticed that before we started doing the thematic analysis, but that's an emergent idea which comes to our attention. It crops up as we do the thematic analysis. So, a thematic analysis is identifying emergent facts that we identify during and after analysing the data. And it's a qualitative research method because these emergent facts are described qualitatively. Okay, thematic analysis has some strengths and weaknesses. On the one side, it's completely flexible. And the reason for that, obviously, is because you're only going to notice the themes as they emerge. You start out without any research agenda and just identify the themes as they emerge during the analysis. Also, on the positive side, the subjective nature of thematic analysis allows researchers to bring their own expertise, their own personal experience, and their own perspective to the thematic analysis. And that can be very fruitful. On the negative side, obviously, we can't really use statistics with thematic analysis because the qualitative data that it generates is not amenable to numerical analysis. And also, on the negative side, the subjectivity means that we may not spot themes which don't personally chime with us, that researchers might not spot themes that they personally don't relate to. So the fact that it's subjective is positive and negative. Okay, in a moment we'll have a look at case studies, but first it is time for this week's random psychology fact.
This week's random psychology fact is that while you are intoxicated, the brain is unable to form memories.
So no, you didn't forget what happened last night. The memory was never formed.
Well, that was this week's random psychology fact. Now, case studies. Case studies are detailed studies of an individual, an institution, or an event. They use information from a wide range of research methods. So, for example, if we're investigating an individual, we might interview that individual, we might do observations of that person, we might interview their family, we might give them a brain scan or some other biological investigation. Case studies, a good case study will include both qualitative and quantitative data. And a good case study will also be longitudinal and look at the event or the person over time. They're very thorough and very detailed. And a case study that you might be aware of, that you looked at in year 12, would be that of Clive Wearing, who lost a part of his brain to brain surgery and then had an impaired memory as a result. Case studies have obviously advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, they generate very rich, detailed data because they use lots of different research methods in the same study. And this means that they can provide new insights into behaviour. And also, if we use multiple different research methods and they arrive at the same conclusion, then that increases our confidence in the validity of that conclusion, and that's called converging evidence. Case studies allow us to investigate rare and unusual behaviour that we might not otherwise be able to investigate for ethical reasons. Obviously, it's not possible to deliberately damage a person's brain to see what the effect on their memory might be, but because unfortunately for Clive Wearing he had to have the brain surgery, then that gave us an opportunity to examine what that brain damage would do to his memory. On the negative side, there's a problem with generalisability for case studies because obviously they're only one person or event or institution, and there is a question mark when we talk about generalising the conclusions to other people or other events or other institutions. And there's also a problem with confidentiality and informed consent. That Clive Wearing is completely identifiable in that case study and everybody knows who he is, even though he himself was not able to give informed consent and his family had to do it for him. Okay, so in this video we have looked at content analysis, thematic analysis and case studies.